The sound was terrifying, a twisted mix of a human scream and a guttural animal growl. It erupted from the small handheld recorder sitting on the police chief's desk. The room fell silent, every officer in the precinct frozen, staring wide-eyed as the sound replayed, growing louder, more distorted with each loop. Suddenly, an unnatural howl joined the chaos, echoing as though it came from the depths of a cavern. The recording crackled violently, then a chilling whisper cut through. "Run!" Before anyone could react, the chief's hand slammed down on the desk. His face was pale, his voice trembling. "Get that thing out of here," he barked. But as one officer reached for the recorder, the lights in the precinct flickered and dimmed, plunging the room into eerie shadows. A faint knock echo. No, not from the door, but from the recorder itself. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, no one daring to touch it. Then, as if mocking their fear, the recorder played again, unprompted. Footsteps crunching through leaves, heavy breathing, and then a voice. A voice no one could explain. "Who's there?" it asked. But it wasn't just a question. It was a demand, low and threatening. The whisper came again, quieter this time. "You shouldn't have come." The officers recoiled. One younger officer, barely out of training, screamed and bolted for the exit. And that's when the tape cut off. Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But just as they thought it was over, the recorder hissed one final time. And what it said made the chief drop his coffee mug, shattering it on the floor. David never thought this would go so far. A quiet guy in his late 20s, he wasn't the type to cause trouble, much less scare an entire police department. All he wanted was to prove something to himself, to his skeptical friends, maybe even to the small YouTube audience that occasionally tuned into his Ghost H. Unting videos. He'd read about the forest months ago, scrolling through online forums about strange phenomena. They called it the Moonlight Woods, a dense expanse of trees where people reported hearing things that didn't belong. Locals whispered stories about disappearances, strange animal sightings, and shadows that moved when they shouldn't. But it wasn't until David saw a single line buried deep in a Reddit thread that he decided he needed to investigate. Full moons wake the forest up, but never ever stay past midnight. It sounded like nonsense, the kind of urban legend meant to spook teenagers. But it stuck with him, gnawing at the back of his mind. So when the next full moon rolled around, David packed his equipment, a flashlight, his trusty recorder, and a camera and drove out to the edge of the forest. The first few hours were uneventful. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. He wandered along the trails, his flashlight bouncing off the trees, talking to the camera in his usual upbeat tone. "Looks like the Moonlight Woods is just another overhyped story," he said with a shrug, tilting his camera to capture the glowing full moon through the canopy. "Guess I'll leave the recorder here overnight." And wait, what was that? He froze, the camera shaking slightly in his hand. The sound was faint but unmistakable, branches snapping underfoot. He whipped his flashlight around, the beam slicing through the dark, but there was nothing there. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, though his heart was racing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. David decided to leave the recorder on a stump near the center of the forest. He pressed the red button, ensuring it was recording, then jogged back to his car. He told himself he'd come back in the morning, grab the recorder, and laugh about how he'd spooked himself full. The forest looked different in daylight, less menacing, almost serene. He followed his GPS coordinates to the stump where he'd left the device, but as he approached, he froze. The recorder wasn't on the stump. It was on the ground, half buried in dirt, the red light still blinking. David frowned. "Weird," he said. brushing off the dirt and pressing stop. Had the wind knocked it over? Or worse, had someone been out here in the middle of the night? He didn't remember seeing anyone else when he'd arrived. Curiosity got the better of him. He pressed play. At first, the recording was normal, just the soft hum of night insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. But then the noises began to shift. The insects fell silent. A distant howl echoed through the forest, low and mournful. Then came the crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to any animal. David's stomach churned. He fast-forwarded, hoping to find an explanation. But the sounds grew stranger. A faint voice whispered something he couldn't make out. Then there was a loud thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone or something breathing. It wasn't steady or calm. It was ragged, labored, almost hungry. But it was the final 30 seconds of the tape that made David's blood run cold. The breathing stopped. There was silence. And then, clear as day, came a voice. A voice that shouldn't have been there. "Who's there?" it said, deep and gravelly. Then a pause and, "You shouldn't have come." David dropped the recorder. His hands were trembling. He wanted to believe it was a prank, but something about the voice didn't feel right. It didn't feel human. Against his better judgment, he took the recording to the police, hoping they could make sense of it. Maybe it was just some local messing around trying to scare trespassers. Or maybe no. He didn't want to finish that thought. The officers listened to the tap, in silence, their faces growing more serious with each passing second. By the time the final voice spoke, the room was dead silent. The chief, a grizzled man in his 50s, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Is this a joke?" he finally asked, his voice low. David shook his head. "I swear it's not. I don't even know how." Before he could finish, the recording glitched, letting out a high-pitched screech that made everyone in the room wince. Then came the whisper, louder this time. "Run!" The chief shot to his feet, his face pale. "Turn it off. Now." But it wouldn't stop. The recorder hissed, the footsteps growing louder, closer, until bang! The sound of the precinct door slamming shut made everyone jump. One of the younger officers ran to check, but there was no one there. "Sir," another officer stammered, pointing at the recorder. "It's still playing." And that's when it spoke again. "You're next." The room erupted into chaos. The younger officer by the door stumbled backward, his face pale as he stared into the empty hallway. The recorder, still sitting in the middle of the chief's desk, crackled and hissed, but no one dared touch it. It let out one final distorted screech before falling silent, as if it had burned itself out. "Take it out," the chief barked, his voice breaking the tension. He grabbed the recorder with a handkerchief like it was a contaminated object and shoved it into a nearby evidence bag. "No one touches this until we figure out what's going on." David stood frozen, his palms sweating. "Chief." "Swear I don't know how you need to leave," the chief interrupted, pointing toward the exit. His usual commanding tone was replaced with something David had never heard before: fear. "But leave." The chief's sharp voice left no room for argument. David turned on his heel and walked out, his mind racing. His car was parked a block away, but every step he made forward it felt heavier than the last. The streets outside the station were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He climbed into his car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. What had he just dragged himself into? Inside the station, the chief paced the room, his mind churning. He had seen a lot in his 30 years of service, but nothing like this. "Johnson, get me tech support," he ordered, gesturing toward a younger officer. "We need to analyze that recording and get someone to sweep the woods where this guy claims he found it." Johnson hesitated. "Do you really think I don't think anything?" the chief snapped. "I want answers." He glanced at the evidence bag sitting on the desk, its contents now silent but still radiating unease. For a brief moment, he wondered if they should just destroy the recorder. But something in his gut told him that whatever this was, it wouldn't go away so easily. David didn't go home. Instead, he drove aimlessly, replaying the events in his mind. Every sound around him, the rumble of his car engine, the honk of a passing vehicle, felt amplified, unnatural. He pulled into an empty parking lot and sat there, staring at his phone. His YouTube channel was still open on the screen, the latest video he'd posted sitting at a measly 200 views. Normally, he'd feel a pang of disappointment. Now, he couldn't care less. He didn't even know if he'd ever upload again. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A text from his friend Chris popped up. "How's the ghost hunting trip? Catch anything cool?" David stared at the message. Chris had always been the skeptic in their group, the guy who laughed off every creepy story with a snarky comment. Normally, David would have fired back with a sarcastic reply, but now he couldn't even bring himself to type. The phone buzzed again. "Dude, you alive?" David's fingers trembled as he typed a reply. "I think I screwed up. Big time." The response came almost instantly. "What?" David hesitated. He didn't know how to explain what had happened. How do you tell someone that a voice from the woods was now haunting a police station? That it might still be out there? Before he could reply, his phone screen dimmed. The battery was at 2%. "Damn it," he muttered, fumbling for his charger. As he plugged it in, the screen flickered, a brief static glitch, like a bad TV signal. Then for a split second, his reflection on the screen wasn't his own. It was something else. David flinched, dropping the phone onto the passenger seat. The screen returned to normal, his lock screen glowing innocently. His heart pounded in his chest. Was he losing his mind? Back at the station, Officer Johnson sat in a cramped tech room, staring at a computer monitor. He'd spent the last hour transferring the audio from the recorder onto the system, running it through every filter and analysis tool he could find. Most of the recording was unremarkable. Background noise, rustling leaves, the occasional faint animal sound. But the voices, those were something else. No matter how hard he tried to isolate them, they defied explanation. They weren't human, at least not entirely. And then there were the timestamps. Johnson hadn't noticed it at first, but something was off. The recorder had been running for hours, yet certain sections were missing, entire chunks of time where there should have been sound, but instead there was only silence. "What the hell?" he muttered, leaning closer to the screen. He scrubbed through the audio again, slowing it down, speeding it up, trying to make sense of the anomalies. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., he found it. A sound so faint it was almost inaudible. A voice. "Turn around." Johnson froze. His eyes darted to the reflection in the computer monitor, half expecting to see some thing behind him. But there was nothing there. He laughed nervously, shaking his head. "Get a grip, man." But the voice came again, louder this time. "Turn. Around." Meanwhile, David finally worked up the courage to go home. He parked outside his small apartment and climbed the stairs, his legs feeling like lead. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the familiar scent of stale coffee and unwashed laundry greeting him. He tossed his keys on the counter and collapsed onto the couch, letting out a long, shaky breath. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. He closed his eyes, trying to convince himself that everything would be fine. Then his phone buzzed. He reached for it, expecting another text from Chris. Instead, it was an unknown number. The message was simple: "Leave the woods alone." David stared at the screen, his heart racing. A second message came through. "This is your only warning." Back at the station, Officer Johnson's scream echoed through the building. The tech room door burst open, and officers rushed in, finding him curled up on the floor, trembling. "It's here," he stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the lights in the station flickered again. The room plunged into darkness, and a low growl rumbled from somewhere in the building. The chief drew his weapon, his hands shaking. "Everyone stay together," he ordered. "No one moves alone." But as the growl grew louder, reverberating through the walls, they realized they weren't dealing with something that could be stopped by bullets. Something was coming. The growl deepened, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the precinct. Officers huddled together in the dim glow of their flashlights, their faces pale. The chief stood at the front, his weapon drawn, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. "Where is it coming from?" one officer whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumbling. The chief didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the hallway lead, into the tech room, where Officer Johnson was still trembling on the floor, rocking back and forth and mumbling incoherently. "Stay here," the chief ordered, his voice firm but shaky. He motioned for one officer to follow him. They crept toward the tech room, every step echoing ominously. The growl grew louder, but it wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It was everywhere. The chief glanced at the officer beside him. "You hear that?" The younger man nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped his flashlight. "It's like it's in the walls." They reached the tech room, the door creaking as they pushed it open. The monitors were still on, the screens flickering with static. Officer Johnson was hunched in the corner, his hands covering his ears. "Johnson," the chief called softly, keeping his gun raised. "What did you see?" Johnson's head snapped up, his eyes wild. "It's here," he whispered hoarsely. "It's here, and it's watching us." Before the chief could respond, one of the monitors suddenly displayed an image. It was a live feed from the precinct's external security camera. The lot outside was empty except for a few parked cars. But then, the camera flickered, and something appeared, a tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the glow of the streetlights. "What the hell is that?" the younger officer breathed, stepping closer to the screen. The figure didn't move. It stood unnaturally still, as though it were waiting for something. Then, in one smooth motion, it turned its head to look directly into the camera. The screen went black. David jolted awake on his couch, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure when he'd fallen asleep, but the room was dark now, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. He rubbed his eyes and reached for his phone, hoping to distract himself, but the screen was dead. The charger had been plugged in, but the phone wasn't charging. With a groan, he got up to check the power outlet. As he bent down, he noticed something strange. His phone wasn't just off. The screen was cracked, a jagged line running from corner to corner. "I don't remember dropping it," he muttered to himself, unease creeping over him. Then he heard it. A faint knock at the door. David froze. His apartment was on the third floor, and he wasn't expecting anyone. He stood still, his breath caught in his throat, straining to hear. The knock came again, louder this time. He tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. No response. He waited a moment longer before turning away. But as he stepped back, the knock came again, this time from the window. David spun around, his heart racing. The window faced a sheer drop to the alley below. There was no fire escape, no ledge, nothing anyone could stand on. But the knock came again. Slowly he approached the window, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run. The glass was fogged from the cold night air, but as he got closer, he saw something or someone standing outside. A face, pale, gaunt, and distorted, its features twisted into a grotesque smile. It pressed its hand against the glass, and David stumbled backward with a yell. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only a faint smudge on the window pane. Back at the precinct, the shadowy figure from the security feed had vanished, but the unease it left behind was palpable. The chief ordered everyone to stay together in the main room, but tension was high. Officers whispered nervously, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons. Suddenly, the phone on the chief's desk rang. Everyone jumped, the shrill sound cutting through the heavy silence. The chief picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. "This is Chief Adams," he said, his voice gruff. There was no response, just static. "Hello?" he barked. "Who is this?" The static shifted and a faint voice came. Rough. It was low, gravelly, and eerily familiar. "You shouldn't have come," it said. The chief's blood ran cold. He slammed the receiver down, but the line immediately rang again. He didn't answer. This time, instead, he turned to his officers, his face grim. "We're shutting this place down," he announced. "Everyone out. Now." But Chief, one of the older officers, began, but the chief cut him off. "Don't argue with me. Get to your cars and go home. Well, regroup in the morning." Reluctantly, the officers began gathering their things. But as they moved toward the exit, the lights in the building went out entirely, plunging the station into complete darkness. And then they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, echoing through the empty halls. The chief turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Stay calm," he ordered, though his voice was tight. "Everyone stay together." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. "You can't leave." The flashlight beams darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing there. Just shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. One of the younger officers panicked, bolting toward the door. "I'm not staying here," he shouted, fumbling with the lock. "Wait," the chief yelled, but it was too late. The officer yanked the door open and sprinted into the night. The others stood frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the footsteps stopped. The room was silent again, save for their ragged breathing. "Is it gone?" one officer whispered. Before anyone could answer, a blood-curdling scream echoed from outside. It was the officer who had run. The chief didn't hesitate. "Stay here," he barked, rushing out the door with his flashlight. The others waited, their hearts pounding. Minutes passed. Then the scream stopped, and the chief didn't come. Back. The silence in the precinct was unbearable. Every officer stood frozen, gripping their weapons tightly, their eyes darting to the door the chief had rushed through. The scream outside still echoed in their ears, but what scared them more was the sudden crushing silence that followed. Should we go after him?" one officer stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "No way," another replied, his knuckles white as he clutched his gun. "Whatever's out there, it got him too. We stay here, together." A loud bang on the roof made them all jump. The sound of something heavy, dragging across the ceiling, sent shivers down their spines. One of the officers, an older man named Reynolds, whispered, "This isn't right. None of this is right." The dragging noise stopped, replaced by a faint tapping like fingernails running across metal. It moved in erratic patterns circling the building. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Outside, Chief Adams crouched low, his flashlight cutting weak beams through the dark. He had followed the scream to the edge of the parking lot, but there was no sign of the young officer who had run. His car was still parked where he'd left it, untouched, but the officer himself was gone. "Collins," the chief called, his voice echoing in the still night air. "Answer me." There was no reply. He turned in slow circles, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally under the glow of the streetlights, twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. Then he saw it. Just beyond the edge of the lot, where the darkness was thickest, something moved. A shape, tall and thin, shifting unnaturally. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and its limbs seemed too long, bending in ways they shouldn't. The chief's breath caught in his throat. "Collins?" he called again, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It took a step, forward, then another, the movement jerky and unnatural. The chief's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. He raised his flashlight, the beam catching the thing's face. It wasn't Collins. The face was pale and hollow, with sunken black pits where its eyes should have been. Its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, teeth glinting in the light. It let out a low growl, a sound that didn't belong in this world. The chief turned and ran. Inside the station, the officers huddled closer together, their flashlights flickering. Reynolds clutched a crucifix around his neck, muttering prayers under his breath. The youngest officer, a woman named Davis, gripped her gun so tightly her hands were shaking. "Where's the chief?" Davis whispered, her voice cracking. "He should have been back by now." "Shut up," another officer hissed. "You're not helping." Suddenly, the front door slammed open with a deafening bang. Every flashlight turned toward the noise, and they all raised their weapons, hearts pounding. For a moment, no one moved. Then the beam of one flashlight landed on a figure stumbling through the door. It was the chief. "Chief Adams," Reynolds called, rushing toward him. But as the chief stepped into the light, Reynolds stopped in his tracks. Something was wrong. The chief's face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His uniform was torn, and his hands were trembling at his sides. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the others. He just stood there, staring at nothing. "Chief?" Reynolds tried again, his voice softer now. "Are you okay?" Adams finally looked up, his eyes locking onto Reynolds. But there was no recognition in his gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, but the only sound that came out was a low, guttural growl. "Stay back," Davis shouted, pointing her gun at the chief. "Something's wrong with him." The chief took a step forward, his vehement, slow, and deliberate. Then he stopped, his head snapping to the side as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. "They're here," he said finally, his voice a raspy whisper. "They're inside." The officers exchanged panicked glances. "Who's here, Chief?" Reynolds asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Before he could answer, the lights in the station flickered back on. But the relief was short-lived. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed loudly, casting harsh shadows on the walls. And that's when they saw it. The shadows weren't still. They twisted and moved, stretching across the walls like living things. One by one, they began to take shape tall, thin figures with hollow eyes and twisted grins. The officers froze, their weapons raised, but it was clear that bullets wouldn't help them now. "Run," the chief rasped, his voice breaking. "Run while you still can." David sat in his dark apartment, staring at the smudge on his window. His hands trembled as he dialed Chris's number, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. It rang 3 times before his friend picked up. "Dude, what's going on?" Chris asked, his voice laced with concern. "Your text freaked me out." "I think I made a mistake," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something followed me. From the woods." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about? David didn't hear the rest?" His phone cut out, the screen going dark again. A faint noise echoed through the room's static, like the crackling of an old radio. His TV turned on by itself, the screen filled with static. Then, through the crackling, a voice emerged. "You shouldn't have come." David backed away, his heart pounding. "Who are you? What do you want?" The static shifted, and the voice came again, louder this time. "They're coming." Before David could react, the power in his apartment went out completely. The only light came from the glowing full moon outside, casting long shadows across the walls. He heard the knock again, this time louder, more insistent. But it wasn't coming from the door or the window. It was coming from inside the apartment. The knocking grew louder, resonating through the small apartment. David's chest tightened as his eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. It wasn't coming from the door, nor the windows. It sounded as though it were emanating from the walls themselves, a deep, rhythmic pounding that sent vibrations through the floor. "Who's there?" David's voice was barely a whisper, but the words felt hollow and insignificant against the noise. He clutched a nearby lamp, his only makeshift weapon, his breath quick and shallow. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. David strained to listen, his ears ringing from the absence of sound. He took a tentative step toward the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the walls. Then, from behind him, came a new sound. A whisper. "David." The voice sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't coming from outside, but from within the apartment. He spun around, his grip tightening on the lamp. The air in the room felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on him. His gaze fell on the hallway leading to his bedroom, now swallowed in shadow. "Who's there?" he asked again, his voice shaking. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "You shouldn't have come." At the precinct, chaos erupted. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, taking on grotesque forms that seemed to mock the officers. Faces with hollow eyes and jagged mouths leered at them, their movements jerky and unnatural. Reynolds, gripping his crucifix tightly, shouted a prayer, his voice trembling. "Deliver us from evil." The shadows lunged. One elongated shape reached out with tendrils of darkness, grabbing an officer and pulling him into the wall. His screams echoed for a brief moment before they were cut off entirely. "Shoot!" Davis yelled, opening fur. The deafening gunshots rang out, but the bullets passed through the shadows harmlessly, punching holes into the plaster behind them. "It's not working!" another officer cried, backing into a corner. Chief Adams, still pale and trembling, raised his voice. "We need to leave. Now." "What about Collins?" Reynolds asked, his voice frantic. The chief's face darkened. "Collins is gone. If you want to survive, follow me." The remaining officers didn't need convincing. They moved as a group toward the exit, keeping their flashlights trained on the shifting shadows. The figures in the walls seemed to grow bolder, their movements faster, more erratic. One of the shadows lashed out, grazing Davis's arm. She screamed, clutching at the wound, a deep, searing gash that looked as though it had been burned. "Hurry!" the chief shouted, shoving open the precinct's front door. The group spilled out into the night, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The parking lot was empty, eerily still. They bolted toward their vehicles, but as they approached, they saw them. Figures, standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the glow of the streetlights. Dozens of them, tall and thin, their hollow eyes locked onto the fleeing officers. None of them moved, but their presence was suffocating, oppressive. "What are they?" Davis whispered, her voice breaking. The chief didn't answer. He raised his gun, aiming at the closest figure. "Get in your cars. Don't look back." One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Then another, and another. The officers scrambled for their vehicles, fumbling with their keys. The chief fired a shot, the loud crack breaking the night's eerie silence. The bullet struck the figure, but it didn't react. It kept moving, its hollow eyes fixed on the chief. "Drive!" the chief roared, jumping into his cruiser. The engines roared to life, and the officer sped out of the lot. Davis glanced in her rearview mirror as she drove, her heart pounding. The figures didn't follow, but they remained standing at the edge of the lot, watching. David's trembling hand reached for the light switch in the hallway, but when he flipped it, nothing happened. The power was still out. He turned back to the living room, only to find that the static-filled TV was on again, though he'd sworn it had been off just moments before. The whisper came again, this time louder. "David, don't turn around." He froze, his body stiff. The whisper was so close now, it felt like it was coming from just over his shoulder. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. A cold breath brushed against the back of his neck. Then, slowly, something began to take shape in his peripheral vision, a dark, twisted figure, its outline wavering like smoke. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the air itself were being pulled toward it. David squeezed his eyes shut. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the whisper shifted, becoming a low, guttural growl. The sound grew louder, deeper, until it filled the room, shaking the walls. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. When David opened his eyes, the figure was gone. The room was still again, the only sound his ragged breathing. He stumbled back toward the couch, his legs barely supporting him. But as he sank into the cushions, his phone buzzed, lighting up the dark room. The screen displayed a single message: "You can't escape. They're already inside." David dropped the phone, his mind racing. He grabbed his car keys and bolted for the door, not caring where he was going as long as it was far away from here. He sprinted down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. As he reached the lobby, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The glass front doors were fogged over, and on the other side, dozens of handprints pressed against the GL. Small, large, some with fingers too long to belong to any human. The handprints moved, smearing across the glass as though the hands were dragging down. David turned and ran for the back exit, his breath coming in gasps. He shoved the door open and stumbled into the alley, his heart pounding in his chest. The alley was dark, the only light coming from the full moon above. He looked around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Then, from the far end of the alley, he saw them. Figures, tall and thin, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. They didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming. David backed away, slowly, his mind screaming for him to run. But as he turned, he froze. One of them was standing directly behind him, its twisted grin inches from his face. David's scream caught in his throat as he stumbled backward, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. The figure towered over him, its hollow eyes staring into his very soul. Its grin stretched unnaturally wide, exposing jagged teeth that didn't belong in any living creature. He turned and ran, his breaths ragged, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. The alley stretched endlessly in both directions, the shadows seeming to ripple and twist as he moved. Behind him he could hear the slow, deliberate footsteps of the figure following, each step echoing louder than the last. David bolted for the main road, his mind racing. He had no plan, no destination, just the primal need to get as far away as possible. The streetlights overhead flickered as he passed under them, casting fleeting glimpses of the empty street ahead. He dared a glance over his shoulder. The figure was still there, but it wasn't alone anymore. More of them emerged from the shadows, their movements unnervingly synchronized. They didn't run, didn't rush. They simply followed, their hollow eyes locked on him. "Leave me alone," David screamed, his voice cracking. But the figures gave no response, their silence more terrifying than any noise they could have made. Miles away, the remaining officers had regrouped at an empty diner on the outskirts of town. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh light on their pale, sweat-drenched faces. Chief Adams sat at a corner booth, his hands shaking as he downed a cup of coffee. The others were quiet, their weapons laid out on the table like useless relics. Davis broke the silence first. "What the hell were those things?" she asked, her voice trembling. Reynolds shook his head, his crucifix dangling from his neck. "They weren't human. Demons, spirits? I don't know, but they weren't human." The chief looked up, his face drawn and hollow. "We've got to warn the rest of the town," he said, his voice hoarse. "Whatever this is, it's spreading." "Warn them with what?" another officer snapped. "We can't even explain what we saw. Who's going to believe us?" The chief didn't respond. Instead, he stared out the window, his eyes scanning the empty parking lot. The diner was quiet, too quiet, and the shadows outside seemed to stretch farther than they should have. His gut told him they weren't safe here. "We need backup," he said finally, standing up. "Call in the state police, the National Guard, whoever will listen." Davis reached for the radio on her belt, but before she could speak, the lights in the diner flickered. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the front door. A faint knock echoed through the room, soft but deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. David's legs burned as he ran, but he didn't dare slow down. The figures were relentless, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He turned a corner, his shoes skidding on the asphalt, and found himself on a deserted main street. The shops and houses were dark, their windows like gaping mouths. He spotted a gas station at the end of the block, its neon sign flickering weakly. Without thinking, he sprinted toward it, his breath coming in gasps. He shoved open the glass door and stumbled inside, the bell above jingling softly. The station was empty. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the shelves of snacks and magazines. David locked the door behind him, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He grabbed a wrench from a nearby tool rack, clutching it tightly as he backed into the corner. The street outside was silent, but he knew they were out there, waiting. "Get it together," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. Just think." The faint hum of the station's refrigerator filled the silence, but it wasn't comforting. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow threatening to move. He glanced toward the security monitors above the counter. The screen showed the parking lot and the street outside. Nothing moved. Then the bell above the door jingled. David froze. The door was still locked. No one had entered. The bell jingled again, louder this time. The security monitors flickered, static filling the screens. David gripped the wrench tighter, his knuckles white. The shadows in the parking lot began to shift, and the screen flickered back to life. The figures were there, standing in the lot, staring directly at the camera. David stumbled back, knocking over a display of chips. The noise seemed deafening in the stillness. He turned toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The figures didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. The lights in the station flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. "No, no, no," David muttered, fumbling for his phone. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow, but it offered little comfort. He turned on the flashlight and scanned the room, his hands trembling. The door was still locked, the figures still outside, but something felt different. The air was heavier, colder. He could feel them, closer now. A loud bang came from the back of the station, making him jump. He spun around, shining the flashlight toward the noise. The storage room door was ajar, a faint creaking sound coming from within. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaking. The only response was a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You can't escape." David's flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out. He took a step back, his chest tightening. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing through the room. "David." He turned back to the door, ready to make a run for it, but froze. The figures were no longer outside. The parking lot was empty. Then he heard it, a low growl, right behind him. At the diner, the knock came again, harder this time. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their hands hovering over their weapons. The chief motioned for silence, his eyes locked on the front door. "Stay calm," he whispered, though his voice betrayed him. The knock came a third time, louder than before. Then it stopped. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the diner's neon sign. Without warning, the front window shattered, glass spraying across the room. The officers jumped to their feet, their guns drawn. But there was nothing outside, just the empty parking lot. Reynolds clutched his crucifix tightly, his lips moving in a silent prayer. "It's them," he whispered. "They found us." Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered and went out. The diner was plunged into darkness, and the shadows seemed to come alive, shifting and twisting along the walls. Then the whisper came, filling the room. "You can't hide." The whisper snaked through the dark diner, each word chilling the officers to their core. "You can't hide." Flashlights clicked on, their narrow beams slicing through the inky darkness. The officers moved in a tight group, their breaths shallow, their weapons drawn. The front window was now a gaping void, letting in the cold night air. Outside, the shadows of the parking lot seemed to writhe, PPL like waves on a dark ocean. "Everyone stay close," Chief Adams ordered, his voice firm despite the quiver beneath it. "If they're here, we're not splitting up." Reynolds, his flashlight beam trembling, muttered another prayer under his breath. The shattered glass crunched beneath their boots as they crept toward the window, weapons raised. "Do you see anything?" Davis whispered, her voice barely audible. The chief peered out into the parking lot, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. At first, it seemed empty. Then, from the far corner, something moved. A figure. Tall, thin, and impossibly still, it stood at the edge of the lot just beyond the glow of the remaining streetlight. Its hollow eyes glinted faintly in the dark, locked on the officers. One by one, more figures stepped into view, their jerky movements unnervingly synchronized. They stopped, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces twisted into grotesque grins. "They're watching us," Reynolds whispered, his voice barely above a breath. The chief didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for the group to back away from the window. "Get to the kitchen," he instructed. "Barricade the door. Now!" As they retreated, the figures began to move, slowly at first, then faster, their limbs bending unnaturally as they approached the shattered window. The officers scrambled into the kitchen, slamming the door shut and shoving a metal shelf against it. "Are they inside?" Davis asked, her hands trembling as she gripped her weapon. A loud bang against the kitchen door answered her question. The officers jumped, their flashlights swinging toward the sound. Another bang followed, then another, each one harder than the last. The metal shelf shuddered under the force, the door creaking as though it might splinter at any moment. "What do they want?" Reynolds asked, his voice shaking. "Why are they doing this?" The chief's face was grim. "I don't think they want anything," he said. "I think they just are." The banging stopped. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the officer's ragged breathing. Then came the whisper, louder now, resonating through the walls. "You shouldn't have come." David turned slowly, the growl behind him growing louder. His flashlight flickered, the beam barely illuminating the dark gas station. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, searching for the source. And then he saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the aisle, its gaunt frame silhouetted against the faint glow of the neon sign outside. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. "Stay back!" David shouted, raising the wrench in his trembling hand. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. It took a slow step forward, then another, its movements unnaturally jerky. David stumbled back, knocking over a display of chips. The noise seemed to echo endlessly in the small space. "Leave me alone!" he yelled, swinging the wrench wildly. The figure stopped, its grin widening. Then, in one smooth motion, it lunged. David barely had time to react. He dove to the side, the figure's long, claw-like fingers missing him by inches. He scrambled to his feet and ran for the door, his heart racing. The door, still locked, refused to budge. Come on," he muttered, fumbling with the lock. Behind him, the figure let out a guttural growl. David didn't dare turn around. He yanked the lock free and shoved the door open, the bell jingling weakly as he stumbled into the parking lot. The lot was empty. For a brief moment, he thought he was safe. Then he looked up. The figures were there, standing in a perfect circle around the gas station. Their hollow eyes glinted in the dim light, their heads tilted unnaturally. They didn't move. They didn't have to. David felt his knees weaken. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." The growl behind him grew louder. He turned just in time to see the first figure step out of the gas station, its twisted grin now inches from his face. At the diner, the banging started again, harder this time. The metal shelf groaned under the force, the door rattling in its frame. The officers backed away, their weapons trained on the door. "What do we do?" Davis asked, her voice rising in panic. "We stand our ground," the chief said firmly. "Whatever happens, we don't split up." The door splintered. A long claw-like hand punched through the wood, grasping blindly. The officers opened fire, the deafening shots echoing through the kitchen. The hand recoiled, but the banging continued, more frantic now. "They're going to get in," Reynolds shouted. The chief grabbed a fire extinguisher and hurled it at the door. It bought them a moment, but they all knew it wouldn't hold for long. "Back door," the chief said, motioning toward the emergency exit. "We make a run for it. Now." The group bolted for the exit, throwing it open and spilling into the alley behind the diner. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound their hurried footsteps. But as they turned the corner, they froze. The figures were there, waiting. Dozens of them, their hollow eyes locked on the officers. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, oppressive. The chief raised his gun, his hand trembling. "Don't look at them," he ordered. "Keep moving." The officers edged past the figures, their flashlights casting fleeting beams across the gaunt, grinning faces. The air was thick, almost tangible, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Then one of the figures moved. It reached out, its claw-like fingers brushing against Davis's arm. She screamed, pulling away, but the damage was already done. The figure's grin widened, and the others began to move, their jerky, unnatural movements growing faster. "Run!" the chief shouted. The officers scattered, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they sprinted through the dark. The figures followed, their movements impossibly fast, their guttural growls filling the air. Mangier 9 by one, the lights of the town began to flicker and die, plunging everything into darkness. David ran blindly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures were everywhere now, closing in from all sides. He stumbled into an alley, his flashlight flickering weakly. His back pressed against the cold brick wall as the figures approached, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. "No," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please." The figures stopped, forming a tight circle around him. Their grins stretched impossibly wide as they tilted their heads in unison. And then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. "You belong to us now." David's knees buckled as the voice echoed in his ears. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a force pressing against his mind, wrapping around him like chains. He dropped the wrench, his trembling hands grasping at the brick wall behind him, as if he could somehow claw his way out of the alley. The figures didn't move, but their hollow eyes seemed to pierce through him. Their grins widened unnaturally, stretching across their faces until it seemed they might split apart. The voice came again, softer this time, but no less menacing. "There is no escape." David shook his head violently. "No, no, this isn't real." His voice cracked, the denial sounding hollow even to him. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled on invisible strings. Its long claw-like hand reached out toward him. David screamed and bolted, his legs moving on pure instinct. He pushed past the figures, their twisted forms swaying as he barreled through the circle. The alley stretched endlessly in front of him. No matter how far he ran, the end never seemed to get closer. The shadows warped and shifted, twisting into shapes that mocked him. He could hear them behind him, their footsteps slow but relentless, their whispers brushing. G against the back of his neck. "Run all you want," the voice said, its tone almost amused. "We will always find you." At the diner, the officers were scattered, their flashlights bobbing through the night as they ran blindly. The figures pursued them, their gaunt forms slipping in and out of the shadows like wraiths. Reynolds had lost sight of the others. He stumbled into an empty alley, his flashlight flickering weakly in his shaking hand. His breaths came in short, panicked gasps as he pressed himself against the wall, clutching the crucifix around his neck. "Deliver me from evil," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Protect me from the shadows." The whisper came, soft and chilling. "You think that will save you?" Reynolds's head snapped up, his flashlight swinging wildly. The beam landed on one of the figures standing at the mouth of the alley, its hollow eyes glinting faintly. It didn't move, but its grin stretched wider, revealing jagged teeth that glinted like broken glass. "Stay back!" Reynolds shouted, his voice cracking. He raised his gun and fired, the deafening crack echoing through the narrow alley. The figure didn't react. It stood there, grinning, as if mocking him. Then it began to move, stepping forward with its unnatural, jerky gait. Reynolds fired again and again, but the bullets passed through it like smoke. He stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of trash and falling hard onto the pavement. The figure loomed over him now, its grin impossibly wide. It reached out with one long clawed hand and pressed its fingers against Reynolds's chest. He screamed as a searing pain shot through him, a cold that burned like fire spreading through his body. His screams echoed into the night, then stopped abruptly. The alley was silent. Davis ran until her legs gave out, collapsing against a rusted chain-link fence. Her chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath, her flashlight clattering to the ground. She looked around frantically, but there was no sign of the others. She was as alone. "No, no, no," she muttered, tears streaming down her face. She fumbled for her radio, her fingers trembling as she pressed the button. "Chief? Reynolds? Anybody, please, come in." The radio crackled with static. For a moment, she thought she heard a voice, soft, indistinct. She pressed the button again. "This is Officer Davis. I need backup. Please, someone respond." The static shifted, and a faint whisper came through. "You can't hide." Davis dropped the radio, her hands shaking. She grabbed her flashlight and swept the beam across the area. The fence stretched endlessly in both directions, the surrounding buildings looming like silent sentinels. Then she saw them, figures, standing just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark, their grins fixed and unyielding. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, oppressive. Davis raised her gun, her voice trembling. "Stay back! I'm warning you." The figures didn't react. Instead, one of them tilted its head as if amused. Then, in a single fluid motion, it lunged. Davis screamed and fired, the shots ringing out into the night. But the figure didn't stop. It moved with impossible speed, its clawed hands reaching for her. She turned to run, but it was too fast. She felt the icy grip on her shoulder, pulling her back. The last thing she saw was its wide, jagged grin. David's lungs burned as he ran, his legs threatening to give out. The endless alley finally gave way to an open street, but it offered no comfort. The figures were still behind him, their guttural growls echoing through the empty buildings. He spotted a church at the end of the block, its steeple rising against the night sky. The sight filled him with a flicker of hope. He sprinted toward it, his heart pounding in his chest. The heavy wooden doors groaned as he shoved them open, and he stumbled inside, slamming them shut behind him. The church was dimly lit, the faint glow of candles casting long shadows across the pews. David collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. For the first time since the chase began, there was silence. He looked around, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. The figures were nowhere to be seen. The oppressive weight that had followed him was gone. He let out a shaky breath, his hands clutching the edge of a pew. "I made it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I made it." But then he heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the altar. David froze, his heart skipping a beat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the empty church. Slowly, he turned his head toward the altar. One of the figures stood there, its hollow eyes locked on him. Its grin stretched impossibly wide as it tilted its head. "You didn't make it anywhere," the voice said, low and menacing. "This is where it begins." David scrambled back, his heart pounding. But as he looked around, he realized the church was no longer empty. The figures were everywhere, their twisted forms emerging from the shadows. They filled the aisles, the pews, the corners of the room, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. David screamed. David's scream echoed through the church, but the figures didn't flinch. They stood motionless, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their grotesque grins stretching wider as if feeding off his fear. His back hit the cold stone of the wall, his hands scrambling for anything that might protect him. But there was nothing, just the suffocating weight of their presence. The one by the altar took a step forward, its jerky movements amplified by the silence. The faint tapping that had echoed moments ago started again, this time louder, as if coming from all directions at once. David's breath came in shallow gasps. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure by the altar stopped. Its grin faded slightly, replaced by an expression that was almost curious. Then, in a voice that weighed, both many and one," it answered. "We want you." The figures moved in unison, their steps synchronized, their hollow eyes glowing brighter. David bolted toward the door, his instincts screaming for him to run. He grabbed the heavy wooden handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. He yanked harder, but it was as if the church itself were holding him in. "No, no, no," he yelled, his voice rising in desperation. The figures were closer now, their movements smooth and deliberate. David spun around, pressing his back against the door. "Stay back," he screamed, his hands clutching the handle as if it might somehow protect him. One of the figures stopped just a few feet from him, its head tilted sharply to the side, the motion quick and unnatural. It opened its mouth, and a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a growl escaped its twisted lips. "You cannot leave," it said, its voice low and guttural. "You brought us here." Chief Adams stumbled into the deserted parking lot of a nearby grocery store, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The others were gone, Davis, Reynolds, everyone. He had heard their screams echoing through the streets, but hadn't dared to look back. Now he stood alone, the faint hum of a flickering streetlight, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. He leaned against a rusted shopping cart, his hand clutching his side. Blood trickled through his fingers, the result of a jagged gash he didn't remember getting. His flashlight flickered weakly in his other hand, casting faint beams across the cracked asphalt. "They're gone," he muttered to himself, his voice shaky. "It's just me now." The whisper came, soft and mocking. "Not just you." The chief's head snapped up, his flashlight swinging wildly. At first, he saw nothing but empty shadows. Then, just beyond the edge of the light, something moved. "Show yourself," he barked, raising his gun. The whisper key, aim again, closer this time. "You cannot stop us." From the darkness, a figure emerged. Tall, thin, and impossibly still, it stepped into the faint glow of the streetlight. Its hollow eyes locked onto the chief, its grin stretching wide. Adams fired. The shot rang out, shattering the silence, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, its grin unchanging, as if mocking him. Adams fired again, then again, but the bullets passed through it like smoke. The chief's hand trembled as he lowered the gun. What are you?" The figure didn't answer. It simply raised one long, claw-like hand and pointed directly at him. The chief felt a wave of cold wash over him, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground as the darkness closed in. Back in the church, David had given up on the door. He scrambled toward the altar, his mind racing. The figures followed, their movements slow but deliberate, their whispers filling the air. "You brought us here," they said, their voices overlapping in an eerie chorus. "You cannot escape." David's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might save him. His gaze landed on the massive cross hanging above the altar, its wooden surface worn but solid. "Help me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, someone help me." The figures stopped, their hollow eyes fixed on him. For a brief moment, the whispers ceased, and the silence was deafening. Then the one by the altar spoke, its voice low and resonant. "There is no help," it said, stepping closer. "You belong to us now." David's hand brushed against a heavy candlestick on the altar. Without thinking, he grabbed it and swung wildly at the figure. The metal connected with a sickening thud, and the figure staggered back, its grin faltering. For the first time, David saw something in its hollow eyes that almost looked like pain. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted for the side door, his legs oving on pure adrenaline. This time, the door gave way, and he burst into the night, the cold air stinging his lungs. He didn't stop running. The church receded into the distance, its silhouette disappearing into the dark. But the whispers followed, faint but persistent, carried on the wind. Chief Adams awoke to find himself lying on the cold asphalt. The street light above him had gone out, leaving him in near total darkness. His head throbbed, and his vision was blurry, but he could make out the faint outline of a figure standing over him. "Get away from me," he croaked, his voice weak. The figure crouched down, its hollow eyes glinting faintly. "You cannot fight us," it said, its grin widening. "You can only join us." Adams tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold against his skin. Then, in a voice that sent a chill through his soul, it whispered, "It's your turn now." The darkness closed in, swallowing him whole. David didn't know how far he had run, but when he finally stopped, he found himself at the edge of the forest. The same forest where this nightmare had begun. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches clawing at the night sky. He dropped to his knees, his body trembling. "What do you want from me?" he yelled into the darkness. The whispers came again, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. "You woke us," they said. "And now, we are free." David's mind raced. He had to find a way to end this, to put them back whatever they were. He forced himself to his feet, his eyes scanning the dark forest. If this was where it started, maybe it was also where it could end. He stepped into the forest, the shadows closing in around him. The forest seemed alive, its shadows writhing and shifting as David moved deeper into its depths. The whispers were everywhere now, blending with the rustle of leaves in the creek, of branches, creating a chilling symphony that echoed in his mind. "You woke us," the voices said again, their tone growing more insistent. "You cannot put us back." David gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening. "Well, see about that," he muttered, gripping the flashlight in his trembling hand. Its weak beam barely pierced the darkness, but it was enough to keep him moving. He retraced his steps from that fateful night, each familiar landmark sending a chill down his spine. The fallen tree where he had paused to check his map. The moss-covered stump where he had left the recorder. The clearing. David stopped at the edge of the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. The place was exactly as he remembered it, yet different. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself were watching him. The full moon hung high overhead, its silver light bathing the clearing in an eerie glow. And there, in the center of the clearing, was the stump. The recorder lay atop it, untouched, its red light blinking faintly. David approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The whispers grew louder with every step, overlapping into a cacophony that made his head throb. "You shouldn't have come. You don't belong here. It's too late." He ignored them, his focus locked on the recorder. He reached out and grabbed it, his fingers shaking. The device felt cold, almost unnaturally so, and as he turned it over in his hands, he noticed something strange. Carved into the surface of the stump were symbols. They were jagged and crude, but unmistakably deliberate. They formed a ring around the base of the recorder, their patterns unfamiliar yet deeply unsettling. David's stomach churned. What is this?" he whispered. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "It is your doing." David spun around, his flashlight swinging wildly. The clearing was empty, but he could feel them, watching, waiting. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight pressing down on him like a fizz. "I call force. You're lying," he shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. "I didn't do this. I just wanted to prove this place wasn't haunted." The voice laughed, low and guttural. "Your ignorance is no excuse. You opened the door. Now you must pay the price." Elsewhere in the town, Chief Adams awoke with a start, his body drenched in cold sweat. He was no longer in the parking lot. Instead, he found himself lying on a cold, hard floor. The faint glow of candles illuminated the room, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Where am I?" he croaked, his voice weak. A figure stepped into the light. It wasn't one of the hollow-eyed creatures. This one was human. Or at least, it seemed human. A tall, thin man with pale skin and piercing black eyes stood over him, his expression unreadable. "You're in the place between," the man said, his voice calm and measured. "The threshold of their world. Adams struggled to sit up, his head pounding. "Who are you?" "What do you mean? Their world." The man crouched down, his dark eyes locking onto Adams's. "You've seen them," he said simply. "You felt their power. They do not belong here, but someone has brought them through." Adams's mind raced, images of the figures flashing in his memory. "David," he muttered, "that fool in the woods. He started this." The man nodded. "And now it must be ended." "How?" Adams demanded, his voice rising. "How do we stop them?" The man stood, his expression grim. "The forest is the key. What was open must be closed. But it will not be easy. They will not go willingly." Before Adams could respond, the room began to shake. The candles flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The man's voice came again, low and urgent. "Find him, before it's too late." Back in the forest, David was frantically inspecting the recorder. The symbols carved into the stump seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. He pressed the PL/I button, and the device whirred to life. At first, it was just static. Then, faintly, the sounds of the forest began to emerge, rustling leaves, distant animal calls. But soon, the noises shifted. The rustling grew louder, more violent, as if the trees themselves were moving. The animal calls turned into guttural growls, inhuman and menacing. And then, the voice came. "Run." David's blood turned to ice. The recording continued, the voice repeating the word over and over, growing louder and more distorted with each iteration. The whispers joined in, overlapping into a chaotic chorus that filled the clearing. Suddenly, the recorder sparked, the red light flickering erratically. David dropped it, stumbling back as the device emitted a high-pitched screech. The ground beneath the stump began to crack, the symbols glowing with an eerie blue light. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. David turned to run, but the clearing was no longer empty. They were there, dozens of them, their hollow eyes glowing, their twisted grins fixed on him. They stepped forward in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural. David froze, his mind screaming for him to move, but his body refused to obey. The figure at the front tilted its head, its grin widening. "It's time," it said, its voice low and menacing. "You cannot escape what you've started." The ground beneath David's feet began to tremble, the glowing cracks spreading outward like veins. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through his chest. The figures moved closer, their clawed hands reaching for him. David fell to his knees, his hands clutching the dirt. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to." The leading figure leaned down, its face inches from his. "Intentions mean nothing," it said. "You woke us. Now, you will join us." The last thing David saw was the glowing cracks splitting open, a blinding blue light engulfing the clearing as the earth itself seemed to swallow him whole. David was falling, not in the physical sense, but in a way that felt far worse. The glowing blue light from the forest engulfed him, pulling him into an abyss where time and space dissolved. Whispers swirled around him, louder now, deafening, forming words that his mind couldn't comprehend. Then, suddenly, the light disappeared, and David was no longer falling. He was standing, or so he thought. The ground beneath his feet felt strange, shifting like sand but firm enough to hold him. The air was thick, heavy with a cold that seemed to seep into his bones. All around him was darkness, endless and oppressive, except for faint glowing lines crisscrossing the ground in intricate patterns. He was no longer in the forest, he was somewhere else. A voice broke the silence, deep and resonant. "Welcome." David turned sharply, his flashlight flickering in the suffocating blackness. A figure emerged from the shadows, taller and more imposing than the others. Its hollow eyes burned brighter, its grin sharper, its movements deliberate and commanding. "You've brought us into your world," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the space. "And now, you stand in ours." David stumbled back, his legs trembling. What is this place?" he stammered. The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. "This is the Between. The place where your world and ours converge. It is here that the boundaries were broken." David's mind reeled. "I didn't break anything. I just left a recorder in the woods." "And that was enough," the figure replied, its tone almost amused. "Your curiosity opened a door that should never have been touched." Meanwhile, Chief Adams clawed his way through the dense forest, his flashlight beam cutting weakly through the darkness. The man from the place between was gone, leaving him with cryptic instructions and a growing sense of dread. He stumbled into the clearing, nung where David had left the recorder. The ground was still cracked and glowing faintly, the symbols on the stump pulsing like a heartbeat. The air was thick with an unnatural energy that made his skin crawl. "What in God's name?" Adams muttered, stepping cautiously toward the stump. The recorder lay on the ground, sparking faintly. He crouched down and picked it up, his hand trembling. The symbols on the stump seemed to shift and writhe as he stared at them, as if alive. "David!" Adams growled under his breath. "Where the hell are you?" A guttural growl echoed from the forest behind him, and he spun around, his flashlight shaking. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, twisting and writhing like living things. Adams raised his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. The growl came again, closer this time. Adams didn't wait to see what was coming. He turned and ran, clutching the recorder tightly. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees looming larger, the shadows deeper. The whispers began, faint at first, then growing louder, mocking him. "You're too late. He's already ours." Adams gritted his teeth, pushing forward. "Not if I can help it," he muttered. David's mind raced as the figure circled him, its glowing eyes locked onto his. "If I open the door," he said, his voice shaky, "then I can close it. Tell me how to stop this." The figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down David's spine. "You think you have the power to undo what's been done? The door is open. The balance is broken. There is no going back." David clenched his fists, his fear giving way to anger. "There has to be a way. I won't let you. I won't let you take me." The figure stopped, its grin fading slightly. "You misunderstand," it said. "We do not need to take you. You brought yourself here. You belong to us now." The glowing lines on the ground flared brighter, and David felt the weight of the Between pressing down on him. He dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic chorus that filled his head. "No," he muttered, clutching his head. "I won't let this happen." Adams burst through the forest, his lungs burning, his legs threatening to give out. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to find David. The whispers surrounded him now, mocking and relentless. "Where are you?" he shouted into the darkness. "David!" The glowing cracks in the ground spread further, pulsing with an unnatural light. Adams stumbled to a stop, his breath hitching as the forest seemed to shift around him. He was no longer alone. The figures emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes glowing, their grins fixed. They moved closer, their movements smooth and deliberate, blocking every path. Adams raised his gun, his hands trembling. "Stay back!" The figures stopped, their hollow eyes locking onto him. One of them stepped forward, its grin widening. "You're not meant to be here," it said, its voice low and resonant. "But you cannot leave." Adams fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest, but the figure didn't react. It took another step forward, its clawed hand reaching for him. Adams braced himself, but before the figure could touch him, A blinding blue light erupted from the cracks in the ground. The figures recoiled, their grins fading, their forms flickering like static. Adams shielded his eyes, the light engulfing the forest. When he looked again, the figures were gone, and the glowing cracks had spread into a massive jagged chasm. And from the chasm, a voice called out, "Help me!" Adams's heart sank. "David?" The voice came again, desperate and broken. "Chief, please. I'm here." Adams didn't hesitate. He moved toward the chasm, his flashlight beam illuminating its jagged edges. The light from within the chasm pulsed faintly, and deep within, he saw a figure David, reaching out, his face pale and terrified. "I've got you!" Adams shouted. "Dro!" Pinged to his knees and reaching into the chasm. "Hold on!" David's hand grasped his, cold and trembling. "It's not letting me go," he cried. "Please pull me out." Adams braced himself, pulling with all his strength, but as he did, the whispers returned, louder and more vicious. "He is ours." The chasm began to close, the glowing edges shifting and cracking. Adams gritted his teeth, pulling harder. "Not today," he growled. "You're not taking him." The light flared brighter, and the ground beneath Adams began to crumble. With one final pull, he yanked David free, both of them collapsing onto the forest floor as the chasm sealed shut with a deafening crack. The forest fell silent. David lay on the ground, gasping for breath. His hands were shaking, his mind racing. "They're still here," he whispered. "I can feel them." Adams knelt beside him, his face grim. "We're not done yet," he said. "Whatever this is, we have to finish it." David looked up at him, his eyes filled with fear. "How?" Adams held up the recorder, its red light still blinking faintly. "We find the way to close the door for good." And from the darkness of the forest, the whispers began again. The forest felt alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy that seemed to seep into the very air. The whispers were faint now, but persistent, like a warning carried on the wind. David and Chief Adams stood side by side, their breaths visible in the cold, oppressive night. Adams held up the recorder, the red light blinking weakly. "This thing started it," he said, his voice low. "It might be the key to ending it." David nodded, his body trembling as he pushed himself to his feet. "The stump," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's where it began." The symbols, they meant something. Adams glanced at the glowing cracks beneath their feet, now dimming but still visible. "If the door opened here, maybe it can be sealed here," he said. "But we're out of time." The figures began to emerge again. Stepping out from the shadows, their hollow eyes locked onto the two men. They moved slowly, their jerky movements deliberate and menacing, as if savoring the inevitable. David's voice broke. "They're coming." Adams grabbed his shoulder, his grip firm. "Focus, David. You know this place. You know how it started. Think. What else was here?" David's mind raced, flashes of that night replaying in his head. The forest, the moonlight, the symbols. He remembered the clearing, the sense of unease, the weight of the air. And then his eyes widened. "The symbols," he shouted. "The ones carved into the stump. They were some kind of seal. I think they're the key." Adams didn't waste a second. "Then we go back," he said, pulling David toward the clearing. If there's even a chance, the ground beneath them shuddered violently, cutting him off. The figures quickened their pace, their grins widening, their whispers growing louder. "You cannot stop us." They reached the clearing just as the figures surrounded them. The stump stood in the center, the symbols carved into its surface glowing faintly. The cracks in the ground spread outward like veins, pulsing with a dim blue light. David dropped to his knees by the stump, his hands tracing the jagged symbols. "It's a seal," he muttered, his voice frantic. "But it's broken. Something's missing." Adams stood guard, his gun trained on the advancing figures. "Then figure it out," he barked, firing a warning shot into the air. The figures flinched but didn't stop, their hollow eyes glowing brighter. David's hands shook as he examined the symbols, his mind racing. The recorder, the symbols, the voices. It all connected, but how? His gaze fell on the recorder in Adams's hand. "That's it!" he shouted, reaching for the device. "The recording. It's part of the seal." Adams handed it over without hesitation. "What do we do?" David placed the recorder in the center of the stump, lining it with the glowing symbols. The red light blinked faster, and the whispers around them grew frantic. "No," the voices hissed. "You cannot close it." David ignored them, his fingers fumbling with the buttons on the recorder. He rewound it to the beginning, where the eerie forest sounds had first been captured. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed play. The forest fell silent. The sound of rustling leaves and distant animal calls filled the air, followed by the growls and whispers that had haunted the recording. The symbols on the stump flared brighter, the glowing cracks pulsing in time with the playback. The figures stopped, their movements erratic. For the first time, their grins faltered. "It's working," Adams shouted. "Keep going." The recording continued, the distorted voices growing louder. The symbols on the stump pulsed violently, their glow intensifying until the entire clearing was bathed in blinding light. The figures screamed a sound that was not human, filled with rage and fear. "You cannot undo this," the voice roared, shaking the ground beneath them. "We will not go back." David's hand hovered over the recorder's stop button. "If I stop it now," he said, his voice trembling, "it might seal them in for good." Adams nodded. "Do it." David pressed stop. The effect was immediate. The glowing cracks in the ground erupted with light, the symbols on the stump blazing like fire. The figures let out one final, deafening scream as they were pulled back into the shadows, their forms disintegrating into black mist. The clearing shook violently, and for a moment it felt as though the entire forest would collapse. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, the ground stilled, and the whispers stopped. David and Adam stood in the eerie silence, their breaths ragged. The stump was now dark, the symbols burned into its surface but no longer glowing. The recorder lay motionless, its red light gone. David collapsed onto the ground, his body trembling. "Is it over?" He asked, his voice barely audible. Adams looked around, his gun still raised. The forest was quiet, too quiet, but the oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone. "I think so," he said cautiously. For now. They emerged from the forest hours later, their bodies battered but alive. The first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting light on a town that seemed untouched by the horrors of the night. David turned to Adams, his face pale but determined. "We can't let anyone else come here," he said. "We have to make sure no one ever opens that door again." Adams nodded. "Agreed. But we'll need help. Whatever this was, it's bigger than us." David stared back at the forest, his mind racing with thoughts of what still might be lurking within. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said quietly. "I won't let this happen again." As they walked away, the forest stood silent behind them, its secrets buried, for now. But deep within the clearing, beneath the charred stump, the faintest glow began to pulse once more. The sun rose slowly over the town, its golden light casting long shadows across the forest's edge. David and Chief Adams sat on the tailgate of a police cruiser, their faces etched with exhaustion. Neither had spoken since emerging from the woods, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Adams broke the silence. "We did what we could," he said, his voice hoarse. "But something like that, it doesn't just go away. David nodded, staring at the tree line. I know. That place, it's alive. It's like we just put a lid on something. But it's still there, waiting. Adams sighed, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. The town needs to know. We can't just pretend this didn't happen. No one will believe us, David said, shaking his head. You saw how they were. Those things, they aren't something people can wrap their heads around. Maybe not, Adams admitted. But we can make sure no one is us back in there. No recorders, no hikers, no curious kids looking for a thrill. David thought about the clearing, the glowing symbols, the figures with their hollow eyes and twisted grins. He thought about the voice that had whispered in his ear, promising that it wasn't over. He shivered. Do you think they're gone for good? Adams didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the recorder, the same device that had started it all. Its red light was gone, its casing cracked and blackened, but it felt heavier in his hand than it should. I think they'll come back, he said finally, his tone grim. Not today, maybe not for years. But something like that doesn't stay buried. All it takes is one mistake, one person who doesn't know what they're messing with. David's stomach sank. Then what do we do? Adams stood, his gaze fixed on the forest. We make sure that person isn't us. Over the next few days, the forest was cordoned off, marked as a restricted zone by local authorities. Officially, it was labeled a hazardous area due to unstable ground, a cover story meant to keep curious townspeople away. Signs were posted, fences erected, and patrols assigned to ensure no one ventured inside. But the town didn't feel the same. Even those who hadn't stepped foot in the woods sensed something had shifted. There were whispers of strange noises at night, of flickering lights deep within the trees. Children whispered stories of the moonlight woods, daring each other to approach but never cross the boundary. David didn't return to his apartment. He couldn't. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a light bulb reminded him of that night. Instead, he packed his things and left town, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the forest. Weeks later, Chief Adams found himself drawn back to the edge of the woods. He stood alone at the boundary, staring into the shadows that stretched endlessly beyond the trees. The Fories. T was silent, but it wasn't the kind of peace that put him at ease. It was the kind of silence that felt like waiting. He pulled the recorder from his pocket, its blackened surface cold to the touch. He hadn't been able to bring himself to destroy it, though he wasn't sure why. Something about it felt alive, like it was watching him, listening. Adams took a deep breath and tossed the recorder into the woods. It disappeared into the undergrowth with a faint rustle, swallowed by the shadows. As he turned to leave, a soft whisper carried on. The wind stopped him in his tracks. You can't keep us out forever. Adams's jaw tightened, but he didn't look back. He walked away, his footsteps heavy, knowing that this fight wasn't over. Deep within the clearing, beneath the charred stump, the faint glow that had begun after David's escape pulsed steadily now. The symbols carved into the wood seemed to shift and writhe, forming new patterns. And in the stillness of the between, the figures waited, their hollow eyes fixed on the crack that had begun to reopen. The door was closing, but not fast enough.